in the chat, that would be wonderful while we're waiting for others to join. So what your role is, where you are in the world, and what's your school or institution, organisation. Lovely stuff. So I'm so excited for this webinar today. We have had some wonderful, wonderful, wonderful pieces of wisdom shared over the last few months. Really varied topics. We've covered things like we've had LGBTQIA voices in language teaching. We have heard from Amina Dawidi about anti-racism in the classroom. We've had... Is that right? So it's been brilliant. And today we've got the fantastic Sisi from IH Madrid, one of our schools, who's going to share about autism in the language learning classroom, which is such an important topic. We've had so much interest as well. We've had lots of sign-ups for this course. So that really shows us that this is an area that people are interested in and that they want to learn more about. And that's great because it benefits our students and our colleagues and just the industry as a whole. So I think there's going to be some brilliant stuff shared today. I will just introduce Sisi, do a little bit of housekeeping, and then we can crack on. So as I mentioned, this is being recorded. You're welcome to have your camera on or off, whatever feels most comfortable for you. And we'll be sharing this webinar recording with anyone that signed up as well. If you have any questions, please do pop them in the chat. We have myself and my colleague Imogen from IH World. We'll be here to sort of keep an eye on what's going on there. If you've got anything that kind of really hits that you'd like to speak a little bit more about, then please do feel free to pop that as a direct message to us in the chat and we can get in touch with you afterwards. If you have any tech issues, I will put my email address into the chat as well, so you can email me if you've got any problems accessing the room, or if you get kicked out and you can't get back in, but that doesn't tend to happen, so I'm not too worried about that. We should be here for about an hour, and yeah, I just hope that you enjoy and engage and get lots out of it. So let's crack on. I'm really, really happy and proud to introduce Sisi, my colleague from IH Madrid. Sisi manages a team of coordinators for young learner classes at International House Madrid. She's got 12 years of EFL experience, which is enormous, and she has first-hand knowledge of the learning experience of people with autism. Sisi is also a Cambridge speaking examiner and a team leader and a conference speaker. So we're really happy to have you, Sisi. Thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you so much, Hannah. That's really nice of you. Thank you for the introduction. I'm losing my mind over how many people are in this room. I've given quite a few talks before, and I think this may well be the biggest that I've seen personally, at least in my talks. So thank you so much for your attendance today. I really appreciate it. I see some names I actually know, which is incredible. I can't believe it. Thank you so much for coming. I just wanted to say that this is a matter that's really personal and close to my heart. I grew up in an autistic household, and all of this is really, I'm like gonna cry. All of this is so important to me. So thank you so much for coming. My talk today is called Busting Myths of Autism in the EFL Classroom. And for this talk, I conducted a small survey of 92 participants, and I'll be presenting some of those interesting results and a lot of resources for you to see more, read more, figure out more. But before we get into it, I wanted to check some lingo with you. So as I said, my talk is Busting Myths of Autism in the EFL Classroom. Obviously, we know the acronym EFL stands for English as a Foreign Language. What you might not know is that the acronym ASD stands for Autism Spectrum Disorders. This has been used because what's used to be more commonly known as Asperger's or high functioning autism versus the other end of the spectrum, shall we say, moderate to severe autism. They're now under the umbrella term, which is clearly more representative, and many people refer to this as the autistic spectrum and the autistic spectrum disorders. That being said, in the community, there's a lot of advocates pushing for a use of ASC, which is Autism Spectrum Condition, because many people wouldn't like to think of it as a disorder in any way, shape, or form. They simply see it as a difference. Another push in the autistic community is to refer to themselves as autists, I am an autist who has autism, because all of this faffing about with more complicated terms doesn't feel reflective for them personally. Now, continuing with my introduction to some of the vocabulary that we might need is neurodiversity. So neurodiversity, again, is another umbrella term that we'll be using in this talk to describe a person who's not displaying typical characteristics of sociability that you might expect. They may have differences in learning. They may have differences in attention span, form of attention. They may have differences in mood, how that is expressed. And they may have differences in other mental functions. Now, neurodiversity is going to be used in comparison to the term neurotypical. This is very popular in the community to talk about ND versus NT, not in any kind of, fighting way necessarily, but ND and NDs, colloquially speaking, often like to refer to themselves as neurodiverse. And as I said, may have differences in those following areas. And the contrast would be with neurotypical, people not displaying these types of differences in those areas. The neurotypical experience is what we see reflected most often in the media, what we would expect from, how we were raised, perhaps. In fact, neurotypical individuals often assume that their experience of the world is either the only one or the only correct one. Now, I don't know about you, but in recent years, I've heard a lot of my friends who would identify themselves as neurotypical, even if they don't use that terminology, losing their minds over internet debates on whether someone has an internal monologue, or if you can visualize an object in your mind. There's a huge spectrum in neurotypical individuals as to whether you may have a full running monologue or various voices, or you have a smattering of words in your head, or you have silence, right? And that's something that might give you a little bit more of a look into, the range of experiences that people may have in their own mind, right? And that's within the neurotypical population. So you can only imagine within the neurodiverse. Now, though there's much debate on this topic in the autistic community, and I have mentioned this already, person-first language has become extremely important. A person with autism as opposed to an autist. This is contrasting the point I made earlier, because a lot of people in the community do prefer to be called an autist with autism. So I guess the important thing to consider is, what do people refer to themselves as, and how can you do that? If you do know that you have someone in your classroom who is on the autistic spectrum, you may wish to ask them how they refer to it. Now, don't do that unless they've told you first, because making assumptions about someone's neurodiversity or learning differences is never a good place to start in a conversation. But creating an environment in which they can come out and say to you what they may have suspected about themselves or what they may have a diagnosis for, is obviously super important and very valid and very validating. And in that conversation, you can ask someone how they refer to themselves. As I said before, many people refer to themselves as an autist with autism, and the debate over whether this is a disability is another huge debate in the community. Some people with autism would very fervently push to say they have a disability. Now, why would that be? Often it's because they say that the world is designed for people who are not neurodiverse, right? The world is designed for people who are neurotypical. And as a result, the way in which they construe things, the way that in which they understand the world or they move about the world is infringed upon by their difference. Or the design of the world infringes upon their difference in a sense. So this push to say this is a disability from the community is completely understandable. And again, it's just super important to talk to someone about how they would refer to themselves. So the questions that I'm going to answer in this talk are the following. Why are we discussing autism at all? I mean, it's an obvious one, but that's what I'll be talking about first. Second of all, what is ASC, autistic spectrum conditions? Third of all, what can it look like, especially in the classroom setting for us? And finally, how can it be considered a strength? Now, in the stream of this talk, I'm also going to try to dispel 6 myths. So keep your eyes peeled for those myths and how I'm going to dispel them. So first of all, why? Why are we talking about this? Clearly, there's interest in the community of teachers, otherwise you wouldn't be here. I'm very, very happy and proud to talk about this. And I have here a quote from Professor Rita Dunn that really sticks with me. She says, if the child is not learning the way that you are teaching, then you must teach in the way that the child learns. If you've come to this event, as I said, it's clear that you would agree with this statement. And as I said, I put together a questionnaire among colleagues to see what they felt. And on completion of this questionnaire, a colleague came to me and said, I wanted to let you know that this is something that's close to my heart. Recently, I've been talking to a friend who's also a teacher to see if we can start a group or something where we can get more information on the subject, since I feel I do not know enough about it. This is what's really reflected to me anecdotally in conversations with colleagues, but also in my survey. People felt that they didn't know enough. So an effort is clearly being made on the part of teachers, and the information to be accessed feels a little bit out of reach at the moment. So here's a statistic from the survey that I did. I asked people if they felt they had received sufficient advice or training on autistic spectrum disorder from their school, academy, or manager. Now, what we can see here is that strongly agree and agree are in the minority. Neutral could be added to that and still be in the minority. Disagree and strongly disagree is representing the huge majority here. Now, let's not just put this on the academies or the courses or the managers. Often the case is that people do not feel comfortable giving advice or training, they themselves not being an expert. Now, I am not an expert, right? I grew up in an autistic household, so I know anecdotally the experience of my father, my brother, my cousins. But I would never call myself an expert, and I wouldn't be speaking necessarily from my firsthand experience, although a diagnosis was sought when I was a child. I would hesitate sometimes myself, but I think the important thing to remember is the information is needed and people are trying to get the information, and so many resources are out there for you. I asked the same question about people vis-a-vis courses such as TESOL or CELTA, and again, it was very similar. People felt overwhelmingly that they had not been prepared to help or support an autistic learner in the classroom. Now, this is interesting because I asked them if they knew for a fact that they had a student with ASD in their classroom, and the majority said yes. Now, when I asked anecdotally, more specifically, many of them said it was because of a diagnosis that had been shared with them. So if so many people believe that they have autistic learners in their classroom, and yet the overwhelming majority don't feel that they've been prepared, this is the gap that we're trying to address. Now, I also asked them how much they feel ASD is being talked about, the prevalence of conversations. And the majority said that they have noticed an increase in conversations. Interestingly, not as many of a majority as people who felt that they had autistic learners in the classroom. So more discussions are being had, but they don't appear to be addressing the questions. So changing understandings in what autistic spectrum disorder maybe be considered to be are definitely taking place. And also diversity within the community and how autistic spectrum disorders and conditions present themselves. All of this is happening at the same time, leading to some people feeling a little confused. So we return to the question that we need to answer here. We need to teach in the way that the student learns. And I'm going to come back to that a little bit later. So let's move on to what is autistic spectrum disorder or autistic spectrum conditions. The DSM, which is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, the DSM-5, defines autism as an uneven profile of abilities. Is that at all helpful? Perhaps not. It's such a vague term that it often feels really difficult, not just for people outside of the healthcare community, but people inside of the healthcare community to even address. If they have a patient in front of them, how do they apply this to someone? Now, this is from C.L. Lynch, a writer and an autist. Um, and they put it this way: a collection of related neurological conditions that are so intertwined, professionals have stopped trying to untangle them. Don't worry, it gets better. So, individuals on this autistic spectrum are said to experience difficulties with communication, difficulties with interaction, difficulties with repetitive behaviors, restricted interests. So, this could be the obsessive nature of certain interests or a lack of interest in things that they would be expected to be interested in. Some difficulties with sensory input, that could be, for example, sound, touch, heat, light, and difficulties with change. This is what we might be most familiar with. Now, this brings me to myth number one: autism is on the rise. There's a feeling in wider society that autism is increasing in the population. For example, here we have a statistic from the CDC in America stating that from 1 in 10,000 people, that would be one diagnosis in 10,000 people in the population in 1970, we're up to 1 in 54 people diagnosed with autistic spectrum disorder in 2020. So it's no wonder why people are somewhat concerned and feel as if there is an increase in ASC in the past few decades. However, doctors and scientists in the field attribute this sharp rise in cases to improvements in diagnostic, so being more able to recognize it in the community, and also recognition in the medical community, that is, not having the training in it and now having the training in it. Much in the same way that doctors in the past used to classify so many individual disorders under one term that they didn't know could be, separated into separate conditions. Autism had the same issue and has had the same issue over a very, very long time. Now, I'd like to make the point that the community believe, as a general rule, not everybody, that diagnosis is a good thing. Often parents struggle with this decision when it's a diagnosis of a child. And there's so much debate in the community as to this. But if you ask someone on the autistic spectrum, they often say that diagnosis is a good thing and it answers so many questions, especially a diagnosis in adulthood. Now, I'll give you an example here from a very popular TV show, or should I say streaming show, on Netflix that I'll refer to at least twice in this presentation. It's called Love on the Spectrum, and it reflects the experience of people on the autistic spectrum trying to find love. Interestingly, from this, I'm going to try and show it on Netflix. I'm not sure if it's going to work. If not, I'll just tell you what it talks about. But interestingly, in this documentary series, the youngest participant at 18, called Journey, shared her perspective on receiving an autism diagnosis. So let's see if this works. If it doesn't work, I'll just tell you what she said. Now would be the time for my Wi-Fi to have an issue.
Hi, I'm Journey. I'm 18 and I have autism spectrum disorder.
Oh, I haven't heard it called that in a while.
I know, right? Very fancy and long.
So how old were you when you were diagnosed with autism?
I was 17.
Okay, and how was that for you?
I was actually really excited. I had done my research on my own, like, okay, I kind of think I have autism. My mom was like, yeah, I kind of figured.
Did it kind of answer a lot of questions you had about?
Yes, I used to think I was crazy. It'd be like, why do I feel like I'm the only person that acts like this in this situation? And why do I get upset at this noise and nobody else does? Like, and so once I got the diagnosis, I'm like, oh, that makes a lot of sense. Why? Like, I definitely have that. When I tell people I'm autistic, they're like, you don't seem autistic to me. I never would have guessed you're autistic. So I think people make a lot of judgments without really knowing that autism can occur in any type of person.
So that was a really beautiful moment for me watching this show, to see Journey talk about her joy in accessing a diagnosis and feeling like the questions were answered. And this is something that's reflected a lot in the general population of autists, especially those receiving an older diagnosis. Here's another example for you. A footballer called Greg Halford. Now, I did have this linked up to play exactly where I wanted to. Now I'm going to have to find the moment. You'll excuse an ad. But this is an article from the BBC about how Greg Halford, who was a Premier League player, and he actually accessed a diagnosis because his son was diagnosed at 6 years old. And as a result, he thought, it got me thinking. I was exactly the same as him at that age. So I wanted to go and discover who I really was, and that's what I did. So he actually accessed a diagnosis through the process of getting a diagnosis for his son, which is the same as what happened in my family. And one of the really interesting things that Greg talks about here is how sharing his diagnosis after receiving it, and it answered a lot of questions, sharing his diagnosis was a really validating event. Now I'm going to try and find the moment I was looking for.
It takes.
Obviously, there's going to be an ad, as always. But just to continue that point a little bit, he was in the Premier League, playing in various teams, and then he wanted to share his diagnosis with his coach and trainer, and the interviewer asks him a little bit about that.
Community sort of arena.
Talk to me a little bit about that time at Cardiff, as I say, and that moment where you actually felt comfortable to speak to the captain and the manager.
It was a relief. It was nice. It was nice that I was able to trust someone with that information, that personal information. I knew Neil would be fine with it, and he wouldn't treat me any differently, and he didn't. It was a case of I'm me.
So that's a really beautiful sentiment there from Greg. The feeling of being able to share that with someone, lifting things off your shoulder, lifting a weight off of your shoulder, and making you feel not only validated, but, accepted. And this brings me to myth number 2. Not a great connection there, but something I really, really feel must be addressed. Myth number 2, the concept that autism is caused by vaccines. So many of you will know of the reported correlation between the rise of incidences of autism in the British and American population and the introduction of the MMR vaccine in 1989. The supposed link between the two was brought to the world's attention in a fraudulent study by Andrew Wakefield, who I refer to not as Dr. Andrew Wakefield, but Andrew Wakefield. You'll see why, which has since been disproven. And he has been stricken off as a doctor as a result. What's more, the correlation studies are highly contextually dependent. And this graph, for example, shows a correlation between stork populations and human birth rates increasing across Europe. So just make sure to check your science, do your science, and not just believe publicity and people with an agenda. What is proven by science, however, is the significant genetic link seen in families. In twin studies where one twin has been diagnosed with autism, their twin is 90% likely to be more likely to be diagnosed as well. And if your sibling has a diagnosis, you're 25 times more likely than a random member of the population to have one as well. So speaking of statistics, how frequently does it occur in the population? So prevalence rate really differ for each individual aspect of the spectrum disorder, autism spectrum conditions. but the National Health Interview Survey in the US, in a study of children and adolescents for 4 years, 2014 to 2016, they found the prevalence at 2.47%. And that led to a breakdown of 3.63% in boys and 1.25% in girls. In earlier studies, there was a greater difference seen between in the ratio of boys to girls, but advances in diagnosis and how to recognize ASC present in girls and women has reduced this ratio to 4 to 1, male to female. And I think that this graphic represents visually what I'm talking about when it comes to prevalence. So if we consider the general population, which may refer to themselves as neurotypical, you would have here a box to represent those considered intellectually disabled with a diagnosis as such, a box here to represent those who present as neurodivergent, a box down here to represent those who present with a personality disorder, a diagnosed one. And autistic spectrum disorder tends to bracket many of these elements here that you can see down in this corner. So this would reflect this 2.47% prevalence. It goes without saying that these statistics come from diagnoses, and depending on your part of the world, there's a great stigma with diagnoses, but I refer you back to the videos I played previously. Both Journey and Greg Halford spoke a lot about how getting a diagnosis made them feel, validated and accepted. So this brings me to what age we may notice signs of autism. Parents often notice signs in the first 3 years of their child's life. These signs often develop gradually, though some children with autism experience worsening in their communication and social skills after reaching certain developmental milestones at a neurotypical pace. It's also important to note that adult diagnosis for autism is not uncommon. Many studies have shown the frequency with which autism tends to co-occur with other differences. For example, ADHD is the huge one. In fact, 67% of those who have ADHD have autistic spectrum traits. And in fact, doctors nowadays are being pushed to look into ADHD for anyone who has an autism diagnosis and to look into autism for anyone who has an ADHD diagnosis. The overlap here is huge. There's also a prevalence of genetic disorders. Epilepsy can often be possible, and increasingly links are being found between autism spectrum conditions and questioning of gender identity, which anecdotally makes a lot of sense to me, because if you know any people with autism, they tend not to accept arbitrary social rules. And gender arguably would be one of the bigger ones of those. Why can't I wear pink? Why must I present myself in a certain way? So it makes a lot of sense if you think about it. As I said, autism and autism spectrum conditions would be one of the umbrellas under a larger umbrella of neurodiversity, which can include many things, including mental health issues, acquired neurodiversity, Tourette's, ADHD, dyslexia, dyscalculia, dyspraxia. Many of these things overlap, not as well depicted in this image, but overlap heavily, as I have said. So this brings me to the concept of a spectrum. Anecdotally, I have heard people say things such as, we're all a little autistic, it's a spectrum. And that's really not what's meant by a spectrum. Another thing I've heard is, I'm not autistic, but I'm on the spectrum. Again, a little bit of a misconstruing of a spectrum here, so allow me to explain. A spectrum comes from the Latin, meaning that which is seen, and it means a variety of actual appearances of something found in nature. In this context, it's variously used for neurodiversity as a whole, the range of different and distinct diagnoses, how much someone has ADHD, how many things they may have, ADHD plus dyspraxia plus dyslexia. Inside of autism spectrum conditions, spectrum is often used to talk about the functional severity of the overall condition, how much someone must receive support or adapt in order to deal with a world that's not designed for them. And within this, the range of apparent manifestations, what's called the mosaic phenomenon. So as it's such a large umbrella of many, many different things, people can have an increasing amount of difficulty with this, but not with that, creating a mosaic pattern. On the Neuroclastic website, which I would definitely push you to have a look at, it's fascinating. And it's also included in my further reading, so don't worry. Autist and writer C.L. Lynch, who I mentioned before, explains that the gradient that most people believe them to be on of autism goes from a little quirky, in her own words, to definitely autistic to, I'm saying this again, her own words, tragically autistic. And this is what she says people from the outside perceive to be the autistic spectrum. As I said, people inside with knowledge, both those who have a diagnosis and those who are diagnosing, tend to have a much more complex view of it. And they tend to consider the difficulties within these areas: pragmatic language, social awareness, monotropic mindset, that's the narrow but intense ability to focus that results in obsessiveness and difficulty switching tasks, information processing, sensory processing, repetitive behaviors, and neuromotor differences. So this could include dyspraxia, for example, clumsiness, or complete loss of ability to move with intention. And someone may present with little or no difficulty in one of these areas and a lot of difficulty in another of these areas. For an autistic spectrum condition diagnosis, it tends to be moderate to severe difficulty, shall we say, in more than one of these areas, preferably 3 or 4. So what does it look like? This is a famous quote by Dr. Steven Sha, who's an autistic professor of special education, who says, if you've met one person with autism, you've met one person with autism. And that really says a lot, doesn't it? As I said before, C.L. Lynch calls autism a rainbow of traits. And it's just really interesting to me how people outside of the community will just talk about being a little autistic or having a little autism. But when you have a little bit more knowledge on the area, you just come to see more and more that everyone is so individual. Another example here from pop culture to kind of prove my point was the introduction of an autistic Muppet called Julia in Sesame Street, who was a very popular character in their, I believe, comic series or online series, and votes came in to put her on the show to teach children about neurodiversity. And she was introduced by her best friend Abby, another puppet on the show, by saying she does things just a little differently in a Julia sort of way. And I think that underlines my point. You know, the way that Julia, a created character, represents or presents her traits may be completely different to how someone else presents their traits. But we must remember all of this falls under such a diverse umbrella. This brings me to myth number 3. A prevailing opinion outside of the community is that people with autism can't communicate. Now, communicate is so many different things if we think about it. One of the things that people who don't know are talking about is nonverbal autists. Someone who's nonverbal may be described as severely autistic since they can't speak and may appear not to understand what's going on around them. Now, some people can be mainly nonverbal and say some things sometimes, or they can be fully nonverbal. And I'll give you an example here from Carly Fleischman. I'm going to play you a little clip of Carly Fleischman from her talk show in which she interviews James Van Der Beek. If you're quite young, you may not remember. James Van Der Beek is a famous actor who was most popular in the early 2000s for a show called Dawson's Creek, if you don't remember, but famously known to be very attractive. And you're going to see how Carly Fleischman interacts with James Van Der Beek non-verbally.
My next guest has had girls through his windows. He has ridden on a horse pantless. He has taken the Power Rangers to war. I welcome none other than the great and phenomenal James Van Der Beek.
How you doing?
I have read that the network has been able to get you to do some incredibly embarrassing things. Such as putting out a blue jean without mentioning what show it is for. That made people think you were selling blue jeans.
Yes.
Since it is apparent to me that network executives can get you to do anything, do you think a gorgeous girl like myself could make you be my sidekick on my show? My demographic is female, and they love to see eye candy sitting beside me. Laugh out loud.
I think I can handle eye candy.
So James, how about it? Will you take off your shirt and be my sidekick? I mean, will you sit beside me and be my sidekick without your shirt on? I mean, will you sit beside me topless? I mean, will you be my sidekick?
Now, at the risk of making James Van Der Beek uncomfortable, what we see here is Carly Fleischman communicating very well her nefarious intention in getting him to take his top off, and does so completely non-verbally with the use of her tablet tool. As foreign language speakers, we're very unlikely to experience a non-verbal student. But this demonstrates a super important point that those who appear to be unable to communicate can often do so in their own ways. We just have to find those ways. And those who appear to communicate perfectly face another difficulty that I'm going to discuss now. The idea that they don't, quote, look autistic, unquote. This is what Journey was talking about earlier, when people are surprised that she has a diagnosis for autism because she doesn't look autistic. Now, this is a difficulty for a lot of people on the autistic spectrum because they don't present in a certain way. People don't expect there to be any misunderstandings. But as I mentioned before, people on the autistic spectrum often have difficulty with pragmatic language. So this is the difficulty with language in its social context, including things like eye contact, body language, but also conversational norms like minimal pairs or euphemisms. They can struggle not to take things literally. Now, this is an example from my own family. When told that he really needs to pull his socks up if he wants to pass a certain subject at school, my brother was very confused and literally tried to pull up his own socks. And a lot of people on the autistic spectrum report frustration that people can't just say what they mean. Why don't you just say exactly what you mean? And they get into trouble for things like asking if you've changed your hair when it suited you better before, or, speaking very clearly in their words, which is what gets a lot of people on the autistic spectrum in trouble. In fact, my father made sure that I mentioned today that people often get in trouble with pushing the idea that something's unfair. Autists often talk about how something is unfair, and they can be perceived to be a little naive in that respect because it doesn't make sense to them. And that's why they often get into trouble in work situations or in the classroom, because they won't let something go. Another difficulty for autistic people on the autistic spectrum, especially considered high functioning or perhaps with autism syndrome, Asperger's syndrome, which we're coming away from using nowadays, is that they report difficulties in understanding speech in situations where there's background speech or noise, including, music or chatting. They often say that they find it really difficult, and this makes a lot of sense because background noise is often oscillating, and it's hard to predict. And so they can find it really difficult to distinguish between what they should be paying attention to and what their mind has, caught on to. Now, this brings me to myth number 4, the idea that people with autism don't have emotions. Neurotypical people tend to get the impression that everyone on the autistic spectrum acts like Spock from Star Trek, unemotional. In fact, it couldn't be further from the truth in some cases. In some cases, they suffer from hyperempathy, being unable not to mirror the emotions of others, or alexithymia, feeling emotions and not being able to identify them. So hyperempathy may be the inability not to laugh when others are laughing and feeling uncomfortable for laughing because you don't know why everyone's laughing. And alexithymia might be, breaking down in anger or tears and having no idea why you're angry or upset. In other cases, people report being perfectly able to feel the emotion, but just not being aware that it's not showing on their face or in their body language, or the difficulty in recognizing it in others. So a lot of people who have a diagnosis for autism in their youth receive training in recognizing facial expressions and things like this. Now, another really important voice in the community is Tara Vance, who's a prominent figure in the neurodiversity movement. And Tara Vance puts it incredibly well, I think, about emotion. She says, while watching the documentary about Ruth Bader Ginsburg, RBG, I had an epiphany. Ruth Bader Ginsburg, said, justice and mercy, they're very grand emotions. Tara continues, it hit me that to me, those are two of my deepest felt emotions. And then justice, equality, fairness, mercy, long-suffering, work, passion, knowledge, and above all else, truth. Those are my primary emotions. This is what I mentioned earlier, in that some people on the autistic spectrum can get into trouble because they won't let something go. They don't suffer injustice. And as a result, sometimes can experience discrimination in the workplace or the classroom. Moving on to specific interests, I'm going to have to go a little bit quicker. I have way too much information in this presentation, but specific interest is something that we see a lot in people on the autistic spectrum. Here's an example of a little boy on the autistic spectrum who's obsessed with the garbage truck and waits every single day to see the garbage man. And if he doesn't see the garbage man, gets really upset. Specific interests can include so many things. I'll give you another example. Anecdotally, a son of a friend of mine was really interested in airplanes. And so sat down for one Easter week and managed to learn all of the different commercial airplanes that are used by a specific air company and their specs and their routes, and then finished this interest and moved on to another. And this is the level of memorization that you would just not expect in I believe he was 10-year-old. Another thing we often recognize is a change rejection. Here we have a famous depiction of autism in the media, Sheldon Cooper, who says, change is never fine. They say it is, but it's not. Now, we can have our quibbles with how the depiction of Sheldon Cooper relates to people on the autistic spectrum, but change is definitely a difficulty for many people on the autistic spectrum, and they can react in ways that you wouldn't expect. One of the things that we see a lot is repetitive actions, also called flapping, which may include the movement of hands up and down. People may make noises in reaction to change. These can sound like someone's in distress, and they may not be in distress. It's simply a reaction. People might retreat into themselves. This is seen quite commonly as, a removal of eye contact and interaction in the conversation. People might experience severe anxiety or distress. Going back to repetitive or ritualized behavior, this is seen as very characteristic of people with autistic spectrum disorder, and it can be seen in many ways, but I would say that it's not always seen. And also, repeated and ritualized behavior such as tapping your fingers or biting your nails or clapping your hands may not actually be anything to do with autism. They can also be seen simply in neurotypical individuals. But what it can look like is, for example, scripting. This is repetitive speech of previous conversations, repeating back to you exactly the words that you said to them the last time that they asked you this question. It could be lines from TV or film, especially if they find that TV or film comforting. My cousin, for example, repeats Dora the Explorer because even at 22, that was always something that she found very comforting as a child. It could be echolalia, which is a repetition either out loud or under your breath of something you've just said. This is common in neurotypical people to make sure that what you said was correct, but in the autistic community, it may just be repetition, and it may be for comfort. It could be repeated sounds. instead of words. Here's an example from British celebrity news. We have here Katie Price, whose son Harvey grew up in the public eye as a point of reference for many people of neurodiversity in British society. And this is from a BBC article. Katie will often touch Harvey or speak with him to maintain his calmness. The duo banter constantly and have scripted phrases that they say to each other. When Harvey says hip hip, Katie replies, hooray. The scripting is sometimes considered similar to stimming, we'll talk about that in a second, which is self-stimulatory behaviors that many autistic people like to use to relieve anxiety or to show happiness. This brings me to stimming, which you may be familiar with. Self-stimulatory behaviors are often used to calm yourself. They can also be used in reaction to distress or even a positive thing. And they can include the following. Rocking movement, so the rocking of your upper body back and forth or to the side. They can include flapping, as I mentioned before, with the hands up and down, to the side, clapping. They can include actually the opposite of what you would expect, staring off into the distance, not reacting. They can include in a more extreme example, hitting or punching, often not with a objective, simply moving in a hitting or punching way. And they can be for many reasons, which make them a little bit difficult to identify. They can be for stress. They can be for positive reasons because someone's excited. And much like in any other student, they can be for attention seeking. But the reasons behind stimming are individual. I'm going to give you one more example from Love on the Spectrum. This is Abby talking about her own stims, and I'll let her tell you a little bit more.
What kind of stimming do you like to do? What feels good for you to regulate?
This on a slide.
Yeah.
That's part of the stim, and I do this, like closing my eyes so the water doesn't get in. I think it's probably a stim.
Okay. That's cool.
When I raise my hands up, like on that picture when I was on Splash Mountain, it's probably like stimming.
Yes, you do raise your hands up, and I think that feels really good.
I think it was probably looks like I was stimming.
Yeah, but that's fine. Whatever makes you comfortable. Except, here's the deal. What do we do when we're at a play or in a movie theater and your arms have to go up?
Keep them to myself.
And what do we do for a replacement stim?
Squeeze my hands.
Yes, and why do we do that?
Because it's too distracting to others.
Right, because if someone else is watching a movie and your hands are up in the air and they can't see the screen, we have to remember others too. So we do something called replacement stim, which is squeezing hands, because that's not going to block anyone's view.
Yeah.
Good?
Yep.
So what we heard here was Abby's mother bringing her through the discussion they've had many, many times of a replacement stim, which is, I think, vital to consider if you are having learners in the classroom who may be having an effect on other learners. I'll draw your attention to this little diagram that I've made. If someone's stimming in the classroom, is it affecting the lessons or the classmates? If the answer is no, then can it be ignored? Sometimes it can't. Sometimes it's kind of loud, or it will get louder, or the movement will impede an activity or whatever. Can it be ignored? Yes. And then we don't draw attention to it. And if other students are noticing it and commenting on it and making things a little uncomfortable, you may need to use a bit of empathy raising in the classroom. Is it affecting the lesson or classmates? No. Can it be ignored? Not really. Then I would ask you to speak to their support network. Much like, is it affecting the lesson or classmates? Yes. Speak to their support network. So that example that I gave you there of Abby is a perfect one. Her mother is an incredible resource in her life of support, and also her mother's very knowledgeable, not just in her daughter, knowledgeable of her daughter, but also of her daughter's condition as well. So whenever I bring us back to this kind of frustration we heard earlier of, I would love to know more, I would love to help, but I don't know more and I don't know how to help. You're not an expert. Or you maybe I'm addressing the wrong person, but you're not an expert, or at least you're not an expert in that student, but someone is, and it's not all on you. So before you try and implement some sort of system or address some sort of issues that you might be having, I would really heavily push you to search for their support network. Is it their actual form tutor in school? Is it their parents? Is it the school guidance counselor or a psychologist? And can they give you more information on how this person is receiving support in their regular studies? If they're an adult and that's not available to you, you may wish to ask them. It appears to me that you have some tricks and tips that you're using in class. I'd love to know more about that and see how we can implement it into the rest of our lessons. Now, I'm really running out of time here, so I will actually skip a little bit, but I will provide my slides for you to find more information about how things present in the classroom. But I wanted to come on to my fourth question. How can it be a strength? Here's an example of a tweet. When haters go after your looks and differences, it means they have nowhere left to go, and then you know you're winning. I have Asperger's, and that means I'm sometimes a bit different from the norm. And given the right circumstances, being different is a superpower. Hashtag Aspie power. Aspie is a term that a lot of people diagnosed with Asperger's use. You may have guessed already who this is. This is Greta Thunberg, the 16-year-old climate activist, and one of many famous people with ASC. Here are some more examples. Charles Darwin, Emily Dickinson, Bill Gates, Mozart, Stanley Kubrick, Greg Halford I mentioned before, Andy Warhol, Daryl Hannah, Courtney Love. These are just some examples throughout history of people who are known to have had, we know that they currently have or are suspected to have had autism spectrum conditions. You can see here the variety. We go from music to science to literature to sports. The breadth of their accomplishments demonstrate the variety of strengths that come from a different perspective. Now, again, I'm skipping over some things just to come to a conclusion here, but I'd like to bring you to myth number 6. The idea that people on the spectrum are few and not like us. I have here a wonderful quote from Professor Amanda Kirby, a campaigner for neurodiversity, who says, around 15% of the population have a range of neurodivergent traits that are different from society's views of those who are considered to be neurotypical. This is not dichotomous with a hard and fast line that says you are definitely neurodivergent or definitely neurotypical. It is messy. And to return once more to the questionnaire that I did earlier of 92 people who were kind enough to answer it for me, we can see here that 14% of the respondents actually said it was possible that they themselves may be on the autistic spectrum. Now remember that the autistic spectrum is one of the spokes that make up the wheel that is neurodiversity, and the autistic spectrum itself is an umbrella, but I did think that that result was significant. So to recap, 4 questions and 6 myths. Myth number 1, that it's on the rise. It is not on the rise. There has been an increase in diagnosis and awareness. Myth number 2, that it's caused by vaccines. That has been disproved, disproven, and retracted. Myth number 3, the idea that people on the autistic spectrum cannot communicate. With the right methods and the understanding of how they are communicating, that couldn't be more wrong. Myth number 4, that people on the autistic spectrum do not experience emotions. They may well experience the very same emotions, but just differently so. And they may experience emotions that you don't really experience. That intense belief in justice and truth, for example. The idea that people on the autistic spectrum, and I did skip this one, but I think it's a very commonly thought one about meltdowns that are experienced by people in severe reaction to their surroundings. The idea that people on the autistic spectrum throw tantrums. No, as I said, this is often a reaction of anxiety to the environment. And in my resources, you can find more information about this. And finally, myth number 6, that people on the autistic spectrum are different and separate from the general population. No, people on the autistic spectrum are present in society, and with some work on our part, perfectly understandable. So this brings me to Brenda Smith-Miles, who is a PhD, and in a presentation on autism awareness said, I fail to learn your language, and I am described as having a deficit. You fail to learn my language, and I am described as being mysterious and puzzling. I think this perfectly says what I'm trying to say, this idea that we have an awareness, we have the tools, and we have the interest, clearly, otherwise you wouldn't be here. We just need to do a little bit of work to speak their language and to support people on the autistic spectrum as well as we possibly can. So here I include further reading. I'll provide my slides, which do include a lot more about tactics in the classroom, for example. Here are some more resources anecdotally, which helped me a lot. There's a wonderful podcast called 1800 Seconds on Autism. And as I said, the Neuroclastic website writes some fascinating articles on many, many topics. If you use TikTok, there's a lot of people speaking about their own personal experience using the hashtag autism. If you use Instagram, there's a wonderful hashtag called Ask an Autistic. And as I said, the Netflix show Love on the Spectrum is a beautiful depiction of how people on the autistic spectrum are finding love or not. You know, it's a wonderful show. And there's a spin-off, which I believe was actually the original Love on the Spectrum of Australia, which is a wonderful one as well. But I'd like to thank you so much for coming to my presentation. This is my email if you have any further questions. As I said, I'll be sharing my slides as well. And one final quote, because I'm obsessed with them, from Albert Einstein, also suspected autist. Everybody is a genius, but if you judge a fish by its ability to climb a tree, it will live its whole life believing it is stupid. Thank you very much, everybody, for coming.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Wow, that was amazing, Sisi. That was so informative, and I can see there's just so much more content as well. So we will share the slides when we have them, and I'd encourage everyone to spend some time looking through those extra bits and the resources that you've added at the end. I think that's going to be really, really helpful. I'll try and make sure they're really nice and clear on our IH website where we hold all of this stuff. Honestly, there's just so much to take away. I really just wanted to, my favorite quote from the whole thing, I wrote it down because I loved it so much. I think it's really helpful for us as educators to remember you're not an expert on that student, but someone is, and it's not all on you. I think that's really like such a great takeaway for all of us. So, yeah, enormously grateful. Thank you, Sisi.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate the turnout. It's like, I'm going to cry.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, everyone. And we will share the recording of the presentation and all of the slides with you in due course. And please do get in touch with myself or with Sisi if you've got any further questions about anything that came up today. Have a wonderful weekend, everybody.
Thank you.